Now, the Trump administration is increasing the pressure on Cuba's government. In the latest move, federal prosecutors have indicted former Cuban President Raul Castro over his alleged role in the 1996 shooting down of two planes operated by the exile group Brothers to the Rescue. Now, the indictment revealed yesterday is the latest step in a broader push against Havana. In recent months, Washington has tightened sanctions, cut off its access to Venezuelan oil supplies, and hardened its rhetoric as Cubans face deep economic problems and growing hardship. The United States now says it wants to open a new chapter with the Cuban people while placing responsibility for the country's future on its leadership. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is the son of Cuban immigrants. Posting in Spanish on social media on Wednesday, he had this message.
Si ser dueño de su propio negocio y tener el derecho al voto es posible alrededor de Cuba, ¿por qué no es posible para ustedes dentro de Cuba? En Estados Unidos estamos listos para abrir un nuevo capítulo en la relación entre nuestra gente y nuestros países. Y actualmente, lo único que se interpone en el camino hacia un mejor futuro son quienes controlan su país.
So what does yesterday's indictment of Cuba's former leader, Raul Castro, tell us about this administration's approach to the US's long-standing beef with the Caribbean island? Well, William LeoGrande is a Latin America analyst and professor of government at the American University in Washington, D.C. Welcome to DW, Professor. Let's start with that indictment. What is your reading of why this 30-year-old case is only being prosecuted now?
Two reasons, I think. The first is that this is an enormous political gift to hardline Cuban Americans in South Florida, which of course is the constituency that created Marco Rubio as a politician. He's relied on them to build his reputation as an anti-Castro, anti-Cuba, vociferous advocate. So now this is partly payback to them because Cuban Americans, the hardliners in Florida, have been aiming for this for a long time. The second reason, though, is that this is just one more step up the ladder of escalation in Donald Trump's campaign of pressure against the current Cuban government that began back in January when the United States abducted President Maduro of Venezuela.
Okay, so Rubio electioneering, Cuban escalation of US policy against Cuba. So this is legislation, this is the judicial system being used to pursue a political agenda.
Yes, exactly. And it's not the first time we've seen it with this administration.
Okay. He's 94 years old, Raul Castro. He's not in the United States. Do you expect him to stand trial in the US?
Well, I think it's unlikely, but not impossible. If the United States military is ordered to go in there and find him and bring him out, they have the capacity to do that. I think it would be more costly than it was in the Venezuelan case because the Cubans will have heightened security around him after this indictment, but it's not impossible. But he is 94 years old, and he's not running the government anymore. He retired almost a decade ago. So it's not going to change things on the ground very much in Cuba.
You talk about this being an escalation of US government policy. This is not just this administration's policy, is it? This is US policy going back decades.
Well, yes, ever since 1959, the United States government has envisioned the hope of overthrowing the Cuban government and getting back to a situation where Cuba is a friendly and subordinate country to the United States. Barack Obama's last 2 years in office were the only real exception to that. But Donald Trump has stepped up the economic sanctions on Cuba in ways we've never seen before. The current oil blockade that prevents any oil from going into the island is really extraordinary, unprecedented. A modern economy can't run without oil. And so the result for Cuba is really existential at this point.
And we just heard Marco Rubio promising the people of Cuba that a golden future is just beyond the current Cuban government. How sympathetic do you think to this argument that America, how sympathetic are you to the argument that America is responsible for many, if not most, of the island's problems, including food, fuel and medicine shortages?
So in the long run, there's no question that the difficult economic situation on the island is a function of both the mismanagement by the Cuban government and the sanctions imposed by the United States. But the crisis that has really reached an acute phase in the last 6 months is clearly a result of the U.S. embargo, specifically the blockade on oil. And now the United States has imposed secondary sanctions, trying to drive foreign companies that do business in Cuba out of the country. So you put those two things together, and it's really pushing the island over the brink.
OK, so America has its foot on Cuba's neck. The Secretary of State says, well, if things just changed, if this government just changed, you could have all this. How receptive do you think Cubans are being to that message?
There's certainly part of the Cuban population that is so exhausted from the economic difficulties that they've been through ever since COVID, really, that they would welcome an end to the current crisis, however it comes about. But Cubans, on the whole, are very nationalistic people. They fought for 100 years to win their independence, and then the United States turned them into something of a neo-colony during the first half of the 20th century. So the idea of returning to a kind of subordinate position to the United States, I don't think is appealing to very many Cubans.
And what's interesting about where we are now is that despite all the hard public rhetoric, we're also hearing reports of contacts between US officials and Cuban officials. How do you make sense of that?
Well, it's very unusual because in the past, when there have been negotiations between the two countries over the broad bilateral relationship, it's really been at a time when relations were improving, and the United States was offering Cuba carrots in order to get it to change its behavior, stop doing things the United States didn't like. This dialogue appears to be a kind of coercive diplomacy where the United States comes to the table and said, well, you have to do these things or else. And so far, the Cubans have been defiant, particularly around issues of politics. They say they're not going to change the shape of their government, and they're not going to change who leads their government just to please the United States, because it's a matter of their national sovereignty.
And so what is staying the US hand in this issue? Why aren't they going into Cuba the same way they went into Venezuela?
Well, the problem, of course, is that the Cuban government is much more institutionalized, and the leadership is more of a collective leadership, as you see in any communist country. And snatching one person, even if it's the president of the country, isn't necessarily going to change the regime very much. The other thing is that military operations on a broader scale, one of the things we've seen in Iran is that you can't actually change a regime from the air with an air war. It takes boots on the ground to actually do it. And I don't think that's something that the Trump administration wants to do in Cuba. The United States military could occupy Cuba if it was given the order, but then the United States becomes responsible for the well-being of 10 million Cubans who don't have enough food, don't have enough fuel, don't have electricity, and don't have enough medicine. And I don't think that's something the Trump administration wants to take on.
OK, so we have Cuba now, Venezuela previously. Talk us through how this current action fits into the US's wider regional policy.
Well, the United States issued a national security doctrine document earlier this year, which declares that the United States must remain preeminent in the Western Hemisphere. It's a kind of spheres of influence argument, and President Trump has used not the word preeminent, but dominant in the Western Hemisphere. And I think that going after Venezuela, now going after Cuba is part and parcel of that general sense that we're going to create a hemisphere that is friendly toward and responsive toward the United States.
So are there other Latin American leaders who should now be worrying about a knock at the door from U.S. Special Forces?
Well, Trump did actually threaten to send the military in to seize President Petro, the democratically elected president of Colombia, because Petro criticized the U.S. attacks on fast boats in the Caribbean.
So what's your reading then? Are we now entering a more dangerous escalatory phase of U.S. policy in Latin America and the Caribbean?
I think we are. It doesn't look like these negotiations between Cuba and the United States are making any headway. In fact, the Cuban ambassador to the United States just the other day said that there was no progress so far in those talks. And previously, when talks failed in Venezuela and in Iran, the next step was for the Trump administration to resort to force.
Thank you so much for talking us through that so clearly. Professor William LeoGrande from the American University in Washington.
Thanks for having me on.